I am so excited to welcome Tatiana Mac here to Mozilla, who's going to speak on how privilege defines performance, a talk she first did at Perf Matters. I remember when I saw the slides go by on Twitter and I was transfixed. I think about these things every day for my job, but I hadn't seen anyone frame this conversation in quite the way that she does. Also, her slides are stunning. I emailed her that day to see if she would come and speak to us, and I think we're super lucky to have her here today. Tatiana recently spoke at JS Conf EU in Berlin, and this Sunday she's off to CSS Camp in Barcelona. She's been to 33 countries. So Tatiana Mac is an independent American designer. Currently, she works with organizations to build products and design systems with accessibility and inclusion in mind. She believes that design heavily influences our social landscape. When ethically minded, she thinks that designers can dismantle exclusionary systems in favor of community-focused, inclusive ones. Tatiana uses she and they pronouns. So we'll be taking questions on the Pound Diversity channel on Slack. And if you're watching outside Mozilla, you can DM me your questions at Tara Robertson on Twitter. Please join me in welcoming Tatiana.
I want to echo Tara's thanks to the AV team. That is literally the most stressful job in tech and so underappreciated. So thank you to everyone on Mozilla's AV team for all your hustle this morning to make me look good. I feel like Beyonce right now, but with less money. So I wanted to start with a little story about my career and how I got to where I am and all the career paths that I've taken to get here. So when I was in my teens and 20s, I was very enamored with becoming a journalist. I thought there were no more fascinating career than one where I could both tell stories about the ways in which sewer gates were made, why they were relevant, the impact on the people who made them, and also reveal the scandal of Watergate. A career wherein you could make a hero out of a serial killer, and a career where you could make a villain out of a 12-year-old Black boy. So journalism was something that I devoted my life to. I worked on the high school and collegiate newspapers, and I was very enamored with the idea of being able to take any idea in the world and to turn it into a story that people might care about. When I graduated into the recession in 2008, journalism was not a viable career choice. At that point, there was a little micro blogging site that you might have heard of called twitter.com. And there was just these really radical newspaper headlines like death of print. And we know now today that print hasn't necessarily died, but the landscape of journalism has evolved quite a bit, and that twitter.com influences very greatly everything from giving us some of the funniest memes I've ever seen to influencing our own presidential elections. But unfortunately, in 2008, I graduated not only with a journalism background, but also with a degree in environmental science and math. The career prospects for that, at that point, we searched for jobs on Craigslist, and the career prospects were maybe looking at fractal equations for ferns in the rainforest. I mean, I didn't really think through what my career was going to be when I picked my majors. So I did what I knew how to do, which was to design. And I learned how to design in a very atraditional way. I started design when I was 10 because my parents owned a pre-press business wherein they basically they were the step before press, where they would take a giant photograph of a layout, and then that would become a piece of film, and that would get burned onto a plate. And that was the process and that they owned. And unfortunately, when I was 10 years old, that became digitized by desktop publishing software, that this very niche vocational skill became rendered obsolete. So my dad had to go back to school full time, which meant that my mom had to turn her single income into as close as she could multiple income by working tons of jobs. And that left me as a 10-year-old without anyone to care for me. We certainly couldn't afford childcare after school. And so my dad just took me to school. So I sat in the back of his classroom on a gumdrop Mac, and I learned everything from destructive Photoshop before layers to Macromedia freehand to Publisher. And I just love to troll React bros and tell them that those are the newest technologies that will create them automatic semantic React components and that they better watch out for their jobs. But I took those skills and I created all kinds of things. I emailed every single person in my database and said, how can I help you with design? I made belly dancing posters. I made small websites for single origin coffee shops. And I just hustled. And I found myself at an agency where I worked for 5 years. I grew a team of 2 designers and integrated it into 26 designers, developers, content strategists, and writers. And at the end of those 5 years, pitching to really large clients and doing all this work, I recognized that I didn't really know what it was about design that I loved anymore, that I wasn't spending very much time designing at all. And I didn't know what impact I was really having on the world. And so in my current decade, what my mission is to be a good activist and to contextualize what it is that I'm doing. When I got burnt out at that career, I basically quit everything. I quit my job, my relationship. I packed everything into storage and I backpacked around Europe for 4 months, which my mother is terrified about still to this day. It's not the Asian American dream. She was like, so options are doctor, lawyer, what are you doing? But I wouldn't trade this career path for anything. Like, I have been applying to jobs since October 2017 to no success. And I think a large part of it is because I have a very atraditional background, that my all the skills that I've gained don't read on a resume the way that all these companies would like them to. But this is what it taught me. Journalism taught me to seek. It taught me to seek out stories that weren't being told from people that weren't getting to tell them. Design taught me to look at the problems and to understand the complexity of the problems and to identify solutions and iterate on them. And being an activist taught me that justice for some doesn't mean anything. We have to seek justice for all. And so at 33 years old, I know that my life's work is to seek solutions for justice. Hello, my name is Tatiana Mac, and I'm here to talk to you about how privilege defines performance. So I first gave this talk at Perf Matters, which is a very technical web performance conference, and Estelle Wheel is an amazing organizer. And she put me after Adi Osmani. For those of you who don't work in web perf, he's basically like the prince of web perf. So there was all these people there who were just gushing over him. And she put me, really a first-time national speaker, behind him. So thanks, Estelle. But I knew that in order to resonate with the audience, that I needed to tap into what was being taught there. And a lot of the work that we do in activism and in advocacy is not considered technical, and I'm here to challenge that. So I wrote a plugin. This is 2.1. That's how versioning works. It's still in beta release because we are testing it. So stable enough to test, I guess. So with any new piece of technology, you have to agree to some terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions of my talk are that I'm going to be talking about things that aren't often talked about in these spaces. And a lot of what I'm about to say might make you uncomfortable. And that's okay. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I'm just asking you to take that discomfort, to sit with it, to reflect upon it. And you don't have to do anything. Like I said, it's just about accepting that this might make you uncomfortable and recognizing that your discomfort might mean that there are people around you who feel that discomfort every single day. So be grateful that this discomfort for you is temporary. All right, so when we think about privilege, I think a few faces might come to mind. We might think about my girl Regina George from Mean Girls, or maybe Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street tycoon played by Leonardo DiCaprio, or Moira Rose, the eclectic maternal figure in Schitt's Creek. But privilege isn't just reserved for fictional characters. It's very much an element of reality with our girl, Kim K, in Keeping with the Kardashians, or this piece of work. And our own tech darling, Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know if that's actually a deep fake of him or the real thing. And if anyone can teach me how to identify a deep fake, I'm still not sure I know how, and I'm not sure he does either. So when we look at privilege, I think that it's helpful to look at the definition. I think when we were looking at those pictures, we might have thought, oh yeah, those people are privileged, binary, Boolean. But privilege is actually this idea that there is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to only a particular person or group. So it's associated with a specific characteristic. So this is a grid I've made, and it identifies 8 common characteristics. And I want to make this very clear, because I said it last time, but it wasn't clear enough, that this is not a finite list of all of the ways you can identify people. There are many other ways that you can identify people. I'm a designer. I wanted to make it fit a 16:9 aspect ratio. 8 was the number that worked. But when we look at this list, these are 8 of the most common and important, with race, class, gender, religion, physical ability, orientation, nationality, which has a derivative of languages, and mental ability. Again, not exhaustive, but important and common. And there are some default settings for these traits that white and wealthy cis males, Protestant, able-bodied, hetero Americans who are neurotypical, that is the default setting for all of those characteristics. And when I first gave this talk, I talked about the implicit association test, something that some of you may have heard of. It effectively has you look at your own implicit bias by taking a test. And I referenced the book that dives into it called Blind Spot, which is an ableist title. And it talks about the hidden biases of good people. And when I shared this talk with my friend and colleague, she gave me an inkling about how this might be the wrong way to go about this. And I wanted to keep this in the talk. I could have just deleted it, pretended like it never happened. But I wanted to leave this here to show that this work is always evolving, that we make mistakes in this work every day. And I am not an expert. I don't claim to be, but what I do claim is that when I make a mistake and someone calls me out on it, the correct way to proceed is to acknowledge it, to apologize, and to fix it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm fixing it. The person who called this out was Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, and she is an incredible particle physicist. You should all follow her. Incredibly brilliant. She wrote this article, which is unfortunately hosted on Medium, but she talks about how diversity is a dangerous setup. And the TLDR for this is that when we focus on diversity as an idea, we're really trying to make it palatable to the people in majority, and that it's really a form of recreational anti-racism. I won't try to summarize her too much, because I think it's really worth reading this in long form and taking in all of her findings. She assesses the very book that I once suggested. So when I told you that the default settings were white, cis, hetero, American, neurotypical, able-bodied, Protestant males, this isn't random that those are the default settings. And in fact, is that this is systematized. And that is why it's so important that Chanda's call out be acknowledged here. And the default settings are a result of the white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. That is a term that was coined by a Black feminist named Bell Hooks. And she coined that term because she recognized that the systems of oppression that she experiences are inextricable from one another, that she just merely experiences oppression as a whole. People would ask, well, is it because you're Black or is it because you're a woman? And to her, they're not separable. And it's because systems of oppression are intersectional. That is a term coined and commonly misused by people by Kimberly Crenshaw, another Black feminist who I wish more people would read. And so when we look at this white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, these are the default settings that come with it. Where do these default settings come from? Well, if we look at the origins of the United States, these are the people that founded our country. These are the people that colonized the lands of the indigenous people. They wanted to protect their whiteness, their wealth, the fact that they were cis males, Protestant, able-bodied, hetero, American, neurotypical. Effectively, they were making a system for themselves. This system is not something that went away when Dr. King gave his speech. It wasn't as abolished with Abraham Lincoln. This system infiltrates every single system we have in America: the criminal justice system, the education system, our healthcare system. Every infrastructure is a subset of this system. And you might be sitting here thinking, I have some of those traits. Like, what is this girl going on about? I'm not privileged. I have a little secret for you. We all are. So we're going to install the privilege plugin. Here it goes. Oh, there's only 39,431 dependencies. No problem. All right, so you might be a little uncomfortable, so I'm going to focus on me for a little bit. I took this chart and I highlighted all of the characteristics that grant me with privileges. I am able-bodied, American, wealthy, neurotypical. And when I compound all of these, this is what creates a little block. I call it my privilege block. But we don't really like to label ourselves because that's not all I am. I'm able-bodied and I'm petite. I'm reminded every single day when I leave my apartment building and I have to walk at a specific angle to trigger the door unlocker. And when this happens every day, I think about how it's not just me. I'm like not even that short in my opinion. But I think about folks in wheelchairs. I think about children. I think about someone who's like crawling for their life and needs to get out of the building because someone's chasing them. I watch way too much like creepy TV. But I'm able-bodied, but like there's nuance to that, sure. And I might be American, but I'm a first-generation Asian American, so I will never look American. I'll always look like this. And I'm reminded of this fact every time I get into a lift and I'm alone and I get asked, where are you from? Portland. No, where are you really from? Portland. No, you know what I mean. And we have this conversation over and over again because when someone sees me, they don't see me as an American. And while I'm wealthy and I have a $3,000, that's not my computer, $3,000 computer and a $2,000 phone, and I've gone to 33 countries, so I'm wealthy, I have access to regular basic care. I was raised poor, so all of the wealth that my parents had was not inherited through generational wealth, but it was created when they immigrated here, and I was able to build off of their work. Lastly, while I'm neurotypical, I do experience suicidal ideation and depression. And it's not just the characteristics that we squarely have that grant us with privileges, but it's everything above and our proximity to it as well. So while I'm not white, I'm very light-skinned. And while I'm not a cis male, I don't believe in the gender binary, but I present as a gender that isn't antithetical to the one I identify as myself. And while I am not Protestant or hetero, there is nothing about me externally that can cause you to believe otherwise. I don't have a religious head covering that instantly gives you a sense of what religion I practice. And a little plot twist, because we always think about privilege in a negative light. I think we use privilege as a slur. But privilege on its own is actually very harmless. Case in point. Again, I have to make a note that I realize that Mean Girls is not actually that common of a movie, and so I feel like I need to give a talk on Mean Girls as like the prerequisite to all of my talks. But this is Mean Girls is a movie written by Tina Fey from 2004, and it's about Lindsay Lohan's character Katie, and she joins a new school. She grows up in Africa, even though she's white, which is very confusing to the folks in the movie. And she wants to get in with this it crowd. This character, Gretchen Wieners, is one of the side characters. And Gretchen is pretty, ditzy, but pretty harmless, I guess. But there's a big but to that, in that she has a friend, Regina George, who is very powerful. So privilege on its own is harmless, but it gains us power, which is not harmless. And so when we look at this block, for me, we all have a block. And when I showed you this grid, I didn't tell you that it's also a wall. So what our privilege block does is it casts us against the wall. It gives us a leg up. The more privilege we have, the higher up we are in the wall. And if we fulfill all of those 8 characteristics, we see no wall at all. And the thing with our privilege block is it's where we stand from. We don't see it because we don't look down to see the privilege block we stand on. All we see is, this is my horizon. And the thing with privilege is that it doesn't dictate how hard we work, how far we go. At least once a week on Twitter, I hear someone saying something like, luck isn't what got me here. Like, I worked really hard, so like that's how I got here. Don't demean my work. And that's not what it's about. Privilege and luck don't demean the work that you do. It doesn't dictate how hard you can work to get yourself out. But it certainly does determine where we start. And so when we think about that, we have to acknowledge that our privileges are invisible to us. This is a chart that I love. I redid it in a cuter way. And it shows Pac-Man with the dot, the world is unjust, the dot says. Pac-Man says, there is some justice. And then Pinky says, what are you talking about? The world's just. And we can see here how their relative power influences their perspective on the matter. And I want to call out here that the dot can't move. That's a characteristic it intrinsically has. But Pac-Man and Pinky can. And when we get our privilege blocks, there's nothing we can do about that. What privileges we're born with is completely random. But the system that granted us the privileges based on how we were born and what bodies we were born into is not. And so when we look at this, on most days, we're not looking towards our privilege because we don't have someone standing in front of us getting us to think about our privilege. Instead, we're looking to our forms of oppression. And what that means is that most days we're not looking at what we take for granted and the ways in which the system benefited us. We're instead focused on what we don't have, the ways in which the system has disadvantaged us. That is by design. Capitalism is at fault. Capitalism wants to scare us with scarcity. Why? Because it wants us to work harder. The harder we work, the more money Jeff Bezos makes. If we look at a recent example here, Lyft IPO'd a few months ago at $24.3 billion. And this is Logan G. I like to call him Logan Green. And he is valued at a cool $760 million, basically doubling up from $380 million. And this is our average Lyft driver, which I Googled average Lyft driver, and this is what came up. This is not your average Lyft driver, especially not in Portland. This average Lyft driver, based on a study done by MIT, makes an average of $3.30, which is less than federal minimum wage. If you do the math, for 52 weeks a year taking no vacations, you are going to make $7,000. So if we believe this idea that if we just worked harder and we just didn't think about all the ways in which we were oppressed, then we too could change our $3.30 an hour careers into $760 million, right? And the idea behind this is that we don't earn everything we receive. I think we can all agree that we sitting in this room do not, like, Logan Green doesn't work 80,000 times more than the average person in this room. He doesn't work 128,000 times harder than that Lyft driver. And we might feel a certain way about this. This might make me angry that, like, what do you mean we don't earn everything we don't work for everything we receive? It might make you sad. It might make you feel kind of tense. And the idea behind this is meritocracy. Meritocracy is the concept that goods or power should be vested based on talent, effort, achievement, rather than factors like sexuality, race, gender, age, wealth. So here's the rub with meritocracy that a lot of people don't know. Meritocracy was coined by Michael Young in a book called The Rise of Meritocracy. And look at these beautiful covers for books. I love them. So in this book, Michael Young casts a dystopian society in the 2030s, which is coming very soon. And it was a satirical work about this dystopia that was actually what I call a subtweet, honestly, of the London education system and how they were using standardized testing to evaluate the worthiness and the success of students. And the unfortunate part of this is that meritocracy was always intended to be a satirical concept. So basically what happened to Michael Young is that he wrote an Onion article and then people believed it. And I just feel so bad for him because Tony Blair, who he blasts when Michael Young died, Tony Blair was saying all kinds of positive stuff about him. And it's just like, how messed up is that Tony Blair was like one of the reasons, why he was working so hard against this. And to have Tony Blair then misunderstand his work, it's too much for me to handle. So I hope that we can be gathered here today to invite the death to meritocracy. I think we can all agree that meritocracy is a hosed idea. And whenever we say goodbye to something, we experience grief. These are the 5 stages of grief. We'll start with denial. I work hard for everything. Anger. Slavery wasn't my fault. Why not a men's month? Depression. I hate my privilege. To acceptance, which is where I hope we can all arrive, maybe not today, but soon, which is that privilege isn't my fault, but it is my responsibility. And the great James Baldwin reminds us that nothing can be changed until it is faced. So when we look at our privileges and we understand the power that they grant us, that's not all. Gretchen Wieners has another set of friends, Katie, who represents bias, and Karen, who represents ignorance. And so while privilege gains us power, ignorance hides our bias. So step 2 of our installation is to admit your bias. Our dependencies have gone down or up to 43,231. So when we look at this infrastructure here, I just want you to remember that when I go through these examples. So for those of you who work in accessibility, this is a very familiar thing, but there's an organization called W3C, and they oversee the web. They released a study this year called the Majestic Million. It's the 1 million most accessed sites on the internet, and they tested them for accessibility. These are the results. They're very harrowing, and the study is worth reading, and if you want to check out some of your favorite websites, I highly recommend it. But what this graph says to me as someone who focuses on accessibility is that the most impact we can make is actually some of the least complex solutions. Low contrast, missing alt text, empty links, those are things that can be implemented by people that aren't necessarily even developers. That in many sites, those are baked into CMSs. Low contrast is something that there are ample tools to test. So this isn't a result of lack of knowledge, this is negligence. And there's a reason why so many sites fail. The average site has 69 errors, and most of them, as you can see from this chart, are things like low contrast, missing alt text. The reason for this is because we fixate on the able-bodied and neurotypical experiences. So it works for us, works on my machine. So this year, something I'm trying to do is hack the airline miles system. I'm traveling a lot, which I'm very privileged to do and grateful for due to my talking or speaking. There's a difference. When I look at all of the airlines as I was, signing up, I noticed something. Here are the drop downs for gender. They all list, the common trait they have is they all list male and female. And male comes first in all of them. Shout out to, I think that's Delta that added unspecified, which I take issue with that terminology, but they used an X, so that's cool, and then undisclosed, so at least they separated those. But they all list male and female in that order, and I thought, well, why? And of course, like being in this industry, I try not to just like outrage immediately, so I tried to logic through it. Is it because there are fewer characters in male and female, so they were going in like the amount of characters? Or is it religious? Is it because God made Adam and then Eve? No, it's not. And this is not just in websites. This is baked into our census. If we look here, what is this person's sex, male or female? Check 1. Males comes first. And this was just yesterday. I was working on some prototypes for an app, and this is a plugin for Framer X where you can automatically generate avatars. What's happening here is there's a toggle for gender of true and false. You'll notice true is associated with male presenting folks, and false is associated with femme presenting folks. The reason for this and all these things is because we center the cis male experience. This is a video of someone trying to get automated sensor soap, and they can't because their hand is dark. And this GIF continues in longer form where they take the napkin next to them and put it under, and it works. Self-driving cars are more likely to hit black pedestrians than white ones. This is a camera. This woman, Jaws Wing, bought a camera for her mom, was testing it, and it had a blink sensor. And she's not blinking, as you can see. And that's because we center the white experience. This is a little hard to see, but this is the developer tools of a browser. I won't say which one. And it has phones like Galaxy, iPhone, a couple Microsoft phones, the Pixel, of course, tablets. It has iPad, Kindle, and then standard laptop and television non-branded sizing. But the reality of the world is that many people aren't on those high-end devices. Those devices are thousands of dollars. Many smartphones around the world are only hundreds of dollars. And there are brands that are very well represented in Africa, in Asia, like Huawei or Tecmo. These phones are ignored in our own browser testing. So we're not testing for these phones. We're ignoring entire continents. And that's because we center the American experience. Silicon Valley is in America. And so what we call out here, and when we're looking at this, is a failure to assess ranges at a scale, right? Like at some point, people made decisions and they made ranges as to what was sufficient contrast, what was the median skin tone they needed to worry about, and what cost of devices was relevant. And they missed a part of the picture. And that's because they picked a narrow range that reflected them, because our worldview is in fact narrow, and that we deny our subjectivity. We hate being called out on this, and we love to hide behind math. When we look at the ways in which we define our design systems and the way we define our products, we use words like usable and unusable, or in the case of the door frame for my apartment, the ideal range of 5 feet to maybe 5'11", or in web performance, we determine time to interactive, fast as being 10 milliseconds, slow as being 2 seconds, or 1 mile versus 10 miles for distance that someone can travel. And sometimes we abstract these terms into more conceptual ideas like hard and easy, or tall and short, fast and slow, or far and near. And we have to recognize that in doing so, we're looking at the neurotypical, able-bodied, wealthy experience. I just love this tweet because it just shows how we think that algorithms are objective. Ryan Saavedra talks about socialist Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and claims that algorithms which are driven by math are racist. And I love keeping this in here because when I last gave this talk, someone said that I was a commie like her, and I was like, thank you. I really wish that Ryan Saavedra and the person who called me a commie would read these 2 books, Algorithms of Oppression and Technically Wrong. They will tell you how algorithms are not in fact objective and how algorithms are decisions made by biased humans like you and me. And we are the humans in this room who define the viewport for the world. We define the viewport, and inside of that viewport is the grid I showed you. This is what we focus on. Even though I'm not many of these things, this is the experience that I always make sure to protect when I'm building these design systems and products. And when we look at our privilege blocks against this, we recognize that our position is not absolute, it's not objective. Our positions are relative, that we have to contextualize every single absolute with a relative. So we're making rules in our systems. We have to recognize that they are going to be defined by the collective bias of our teams, and that there is going to be stuff that we miss. And so instead, if we look at our position relative and see that we all have relative positions, that's when we can start to identify better solutions. So step 2 of the plugin is to lessen our ignorance. So this is the viewport that Squarely is focused on all the time. And I hate this term in design, and if you're a designer, forgive me for using it, but we need to be aware that we're focused above the fold. And we have to have a curiosity for what lies beyond that viewport. And to start, we can look at consuming media that doesn't center our own experiences. So a little story, when I saw Bao, I was in a theater, and after it was done, I was sitting there and I heard whispers around me of like, that was so weird. What was that even about? Like, what a weird movie. And people were laughing at it. And I was sitting there crying in hysterical tears because it was the first time I had seen something that represented my own relationship with my mother. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I won't spoil it for you, but it's about a mother and child and their relationship through making dumplings. And so when you watch movies like Bao and you don't really understand some of the terminology or the reasons why they might be emotionally relevant, we need to understand that not everything is made for your understanding. And that's very hard to do if you have characteristics that put you in that viewport, because you are so accustomed to seeing yourself in every image. I'm sure many of you have seen the outrage with Ariel being played by a Black woman. A lot of folks on white Twitter, that's a redundancy, on Twitter are really upset that Ariel is not a blue-eyed, red-headed woman. And I just think it shows us how it's totally fine that I grew up my entire life only seeing Disney princesses who were white until Mulan, and then I didn't even resonate with Mulan, and that was like my one shot. So I think it's important to know that, like, if you're outraged by something like that, think about how it might be the result of you being so accustomed to always being accommodated. I'm going to do a hot take on empathy here. I know we love to use this term. We love to say that designers and folks in the tech industry need to breed more empathy, but I have a word about that. Empathy is a scam. Because empathy is the capacity to understand or to feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference, the capacity to place oneself in another's position. Y'all, we can't do that. Like, I don't know what it's like to be a trans woman. I don't know what it's like to be a young Black man. I don't know what it's like to be chronically ill. Those are things that I will never, ever know. I can try to pretend, but it's all being framed within my own viewport, within my life experiences. And what it does, really, it's kind of messed up because it takes someone else's experience and seeks to validate it within someone else's lived experience and validate it within your own and centering your own experience. What empathy does is it aligns the self to center. And so I invite us all to replace empathy with trust. Instead of trying to understand and feel what it's like to be those things that we're not, we can instead just trust the people that tell us that. We need to trust our users' lived experiences over our own presumptions. And most importantly, we need to stop gaslighting lived experiences just because they're not our own. I don't know how many times a day when I share something that happens and someone tells me, no, that's not what that person was doing. No, you're overreacting. You're being sensitive. All of these things are coming from the point of view of that person and their lived experiences. So it might be fine for them, but when someone tells you that something's not okay for them, you got to listen to them and you got to trust them. I love this quote by Angela Davis because the people that are most impacted by things are most vulnerable communities, and we fail to listen to them all the time. And what happens is that if they come for me in the morning, they'll come for you in the night. And what she means by that is that none of us is safe. The very systems that harm the most vulnerable and marginalized communities will eventually harm the centered majority communities as well. Lastly, and most importantly, we need to share our power. There's a saying that's common in accessibility. As a side note, I'm trying to find the origins of this phrase, and it is very hard. Attribution for quotations is very, very difficult, but it's a common phrase that we use in accessibility: nothing about us without us. And what that means is that we should not be creating experiences on behalf of people. We should be empowering them to create their own. There's this idea, I think, in our industry that diversity will solve everything, and it won't. That's the very thing that Chanda pointed out to me, is that more diversity is just feeding more people into dangerous situations and hoping that they'll thrive. And the people that succeed are just the ones that were lucky enough to make it out alive. And there's this quote by Verna Myers I think is lovely, which is, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. What a lovely sentiment. But I invite us to extend that a step further and to say that justice is letting someone else throw the party. So when we look at this, all the slides are online, and it'll be more crisp that way, you know. But when we look at this, this is these are the criterion we have for the people who throw the parties. The parties are being thrown by and for white, wealthy, cis males who are Protestant, able-bodied, neurotypical, hetero, and American. And I'm just inviting anyone who fits squarely into that box to just retire from the stage, rock star. Instead, become a roadie, set that stage for someone else, be a bouncer, manage the crowd, talk to your other rock stars and their problematic behaviors. Hand over the keys to queer, disabled, trans, immigrant, Muslim, Black, Indigenous women of color. And I mean women in the inclusive sense, not in the turfy, trans exclusionary, radical feminist way. Trans women are women. And we must learn to lift as we climb. It does us no good if we all keep fighting this and we don't lift everyone around us, because that's how we got into these oppressive systems to begin with. That the people that founded this country and the people that created the concepts of whiteness and blackness and race didn't lift anyone but themselves and tried to get the people that weren't lifted to fight with each other. So again, Angela Davis with more wisdom, as we must learn to lift as we climb. And so what if we just did this? What if we just took all these characteristics, instead centered poor, Black, Muslim, trans women who are disabled, queer, and non-American and neurodiverse? Would that solve the problem? The world would be a lot better. I'll start there. But it won't solve the problem, because the problem is that it's a wall. So I invite all the Chads of the world. I'm like Ronald Reagan right now, inviting all the Chads of the world to tear down this wall. This is the wall we need to tear down. We need to take this wall apart brick by brick in every action, with every pull request, with every conversation, with every situation that we can. I invite everyone in this room to do this every single day, to make a commitment before you install this plugin, to commit to this idea of resisting relentlessly. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Before we go into the Q&A, I know some people have to go to meetings. We're going to probably go for another 15 minutes. We're going to try an experiment. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to chat with someone next to you. And I'm going to put up a slide about kind of criteria for good questions. And in pairs, we're going to peer review each other's questions, make some awesome questions, and then do a short Q&A. So you got 3 minutes to talk to someone by you.
Really, I'm going to turn off my. You're so sweet. See you soon. Bye.
Q&As in sessions. So this is the first time we're trying this. These are the 4 kind of criteria that she outlined for a good question. So in your pairs, I want you to think up a good question and make sure it's really a question.
If it starts with, well, actually, it's not a question.
And make sure that you're not trying to say that you would have done a better job giving this talk. Figure out, be discerning. Is this question, should it be posed in this setting and answered in front of everyone? And our amazing speaker, Tatiana, has done a ton of work prepping this talk. So figure out if your question is asking the speaker to do more work that the question asker should actually do. So I'll give you about 90 seconds more in your pairs to figure out a good question.
That's great. I'm excited.
Awesome talk.
Thanks.
Estelle joined on this.
Hubby,
who saw you at Perf Matters.
Oh, yeah. Hubby. Oh, Hubby's so sweet. Hubby gave such an amazing talk about sonnets at JSConf. It was incredible. And then I saw Flocky last week.
Wow. The Slack channels are really busy and people
are
loving.
Good. I'm so glad to hear that. That's really lovely. What a lovely community.
So I'm going to just step back and then let you questions.
Yeah.
If there's some from Slack, I'll voice them.
Yeah, please.
And if some of the questions aren't good questions, feel free to say.
I'll point out why they're not good questions and which rule they broke.
Okay, so I'm going to bring everyone back now, and I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. For people who are joining us remotely, I'll be watching on the diversity Slack channel, and we'll voice your questions if you've got them. Okay, any questions?
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. It's a really excellent talk. And I think that I'm in marketing, so I'm gonna say the CTA, the call to action that you had at the end of this is super powerful and was really great. And something that I like to hear and want to share is like, what is a story of having done this successfully? Because I look at Resist and I go, awesome, I want to do that. I want to do these things of consuming media, all the pieces that you mentioned. I think it's super important. And I would just love to hear a success story of like, from either the speaker or anybody else in the room, like, hey, this time I challenged who our audience was. I challenged how this was designed and it didn't get me fired. And I did good work and it was powerful. So I don't know if you could share an experience.
Happy to. My auto mic'd up. Is the audio still good? Okay, cool. I know you all can hear me. I'm worried about the remote folks. So yes, absolutely. And there's a really quick and there's a great question. Thank you. So to summarize, the question is, when you hear a call to action, I'll editorialize a little bit, a call to action like resist, which is maybe inspiring but a bit generic, what can we do with that? And I will tell you that example that I gave of the Framer X plugin, where it was the gender binary, where male was true and female was false. I tweeted about it because I'm a loudmouth, and someone tagged the creator of that plugin, which is called snitch tagging, in case anyone didn't know. If I wanted to tag him, I would have. But this result ended out fine, and just before I walked into the talk, he reached out to me on Twitter, apologized for the impact he had on me, and said he's dropping everything this morning to fix it. That happened within the matter of 24 hours. That is what we need to do. We need to identify when we feel something that isn't right, or when one of our colleagues, especially if they're traditionally marginalized, we need to listen to them and we need to use our privilege to speak up. It's infinitely easier for me as an able-bodied woman to speak up. And we have to be careful here to not speak on behalf of people's experiences. But if you have the privilege and you know someone's trying to speak up and they don't feel safe, talk to them and help to be their amplifier. And identify those systems. So often I think we feel like we're in situations in meetings where things feel icky and we know it and we know something isn't quite right. We need to speak up. Like we know about the Zoom vulnerability, or many of us maybe don't, but there was a Zoom vulnerability earlier this week, a couple days ago, where there was an issue where cameras could be accessed without permission. And the reason they did that was for convenience, so that you could click on a Zoom link and it would auto open to your computer. Well, that introduces a humongous vulnerability for cameras. That's terrifying. And especially if you're a woman, you understand how terrifying that is to have your camera just accessed by a company like this. Anil Dash, who's one of our tech elders, likes to say, imagine the meeting. And I love that idea, because we can imagine the meeting in so many ways. We can look at that meeting and say, oh, well, someone at Zoom should have said something, and we don't know the conversations that they had. And that situation could have played out in many ways. Maybe someone did speak up and they weren't addressed and they were ignored. So that's why it's so important for us to join together and to unionize when these things happen, so that we have power. But that's certainly one example where it worked. So even just speaking up in the day-to-day when things don't feel right.
Thank you so much. That was actually super inspiring.
Oh.
Okay, I've got a question from Slack. It's a two-parter. How do you deal with the idea of a white savior? And do you have a hot take on how to not do that while still having white people appropriately involved?
Yeah, so white savior. So the first question being, how do I deal with white saviors? Would you say that's a fair summary? How do I deal with white saviors?
How do you deal with the idea of white saviors? I think I'm making a guess because I'm not this person, but I think it's how do white people appropriately take responsibility and accountability without trying to swoop in and save the day?
Yeah, so that's two questions from two different perspectives, I would say, because how do I deal with white saviors versus how do white folks stop being saviors are two separate questions. So I'll try to address both. So if for those of you who don't know, white saviorship is that idea that whites will come and save us from the very problem that they created to begin with. If you want to watch a movie about white saviors, it's called Green Book, and it's basically centered around that idea. I think that how whites can avoid white saviorship is to decenter their experiences, because at its core, what white saviors are doing is they're saving the day and they're painted as the superhero, whereas all of the folks of color are being painted as these people who need saving. And so instead of trying to come in and save the day and center yourself, find ways where, that's why I use the roadie example, right? I don't need you to be a groupie. I don't need you singing louder in the audience or singing my lyrics back to me. I need you to be like our AV folks who are helping to set the stage and to make our mics louder and to hand over the mics and step aside. I think that's a huge way you can avoid it. How I deal with white saviors is I just say, I don't need you to save me. I mean, I feel very comfortable with that idea.
Awesome. So I think we've got time for one more question in the room and then one more for online.
So the one thing in there, I liked your talk a lot, and I think the one thing that kind of rang true in my own experience is I'm an engineer, and so for me, understanding anything is super important to me. And so when you said that, don't try to empathize, but trust. For me, I come from my own experience where I'm like, I get that you can't empathize with someone whose background you don't share, but at the same time, I also feel that I don't want to just trust something that I'm just given. And so how do you adjust to that? I mean, because how do you adjust to that? If that makes sense. Because I want to understand, but I also know that that's maybe not possible. So what do you do in that situation? If maybe the answer is to just trust, but I also find myself uncomfortable with that.
Totally fair. Then I challenge you to instead to use that skepticism towards the contrapositive instead. So instead of trying to build trust where you can't for the people who are experiencing the non-centered experiences, why don't you use that skepticism to look at the systems that you don't question every single day? Question the defaults. If you're like, I don't trust things, why is mail first? Look at all of the embedded systems and use your distrust in those instead of distrust in the minoritized and marginalized experience. That's how you can use your skepticism.
Okay, last question from Slack. This person's curious about the feedback you get to your presentations from people in the US versus a more global audience. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I always, when I give talks internationally, which I've only really given one international talk in Berlin, and I'm headed to a few more this year, I try to recognize that this talk does have a strong American bias. I think that what the feedback I've heard from folks is that race just plays out in a different way, and I'm talking about folks of color primarily, that race just plays out in a different way. That I spoke with someone who told me about how race I think in Malaysia, there's like laws that make it such that racism is just explicitly described, right? So everyone recognizes that like Chinese folks in Malaysia are deemed as like second-class citizens. That is embedded into the law. So by it being explicit, then it is, there's no question about it. In America, there's constant questions about it. I get asked every day, like, well, how do you know racism exists? So I think that it contextualizes racism into the cultural ways in which it manifests. But I think mostly the feedback is there's nuance to my talk, but that the general ideas of oppression still reign true.
Thank you so much. Big hand for Tatiana. Big hand for the AV team and James. Woo! Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming. Tatiana, you're staying for lunch, right? Cool. Bye everyone.